right. Well, happy Mother's Day and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone who will be watching this video. I am joined today by my good friend David Gornoski, and we have a very special guest today. This has been a long time in the making, and we've been going over questions for quite a while. But without further ado, I'm joined today by His Highness Prince Asfa-Wossen Asserate, who hails from Frankfurt, Germany. And so we will be asking him some questions about Ethiopia, the history of Ethiopia, the politics of Ethiopia, and so forth. And so I want to go ahead and invite Prince Asfa-Wossen Asserate. Prince Asfa-Wossen Asserate, how are you?
Very well indeed. Great pleasure to see you, at least virtually, you and Mr. Gornoski. It's a great pleasure to be with you too. And in a time when everybody is speculating in many ways about Ethiopia, it might indeed be the right time to also talk about what Ethiopia has stood for all these years and what the future of Ethiopia can be.
Yes, yes. Well, I want to ask you about some historical questions first. I want to ask about some of the things that you think historically. What are some of the things that you think you know younger people should know about Ethiopia in particular that hasn't really gotten noticed?
I think the fact that Ethiopia is one of the oldest countries of the world. We're talking about a 3,000-year-old civilization. And for me, my identification with Ethiopia is a 100% adoration and identification with one of the greatest empires in the world during the antiquity, which is the Aksumite Empire. Who knows today that the second language in the court of the Aksumite kingdom was Greek? All the coins which we found dating back 3 millennia have the wording on the one side is in Ge'ez, and the other side, it is in Greek. There's not only the most international kingdom that has existed in the antiquity, because here you had a whole range of people who had emigrated about 1,000 before Christ from the Middle East. You had the Hamitic people in Africa with whom they joined forces, with whom they intermarried. And then you had the Nilotic people who also were part of this incredible multi-ethnic empire. And if Ethiopia is anything, then it is a wonderful place for multi-ethnic people to have lived with another in peace and sometimes warring against each other. But this is one of the first multi-ethnic nations in the world.
Yes, I can attest to that. Reading through the history of Ethiopia, you see that there was a lot of trade and commerce, going on in the ancient Aksum, and I think that probably goes unnoticed. It hasn't been explored quite the way that it should, but I want to try to kind of flesh this out in the sense that you talk about Ethiopia being a Christian nation, and the idea that, Ethiopia had, it was a part of the sort of, what you might call the late antique and the medieval world. There was writing, and they had, scholasticism there too. And so can you talk about that a little bit more about the writing and scholasticism and the trade that was going on at that time?
Absolutely. First of all, I would not say Ethiopia is a Christian country. No, Ethiopia is the country of the three Abrahamitic faiths:
Okay.
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. How many people know that Aksum is the second oldest community, Islamic community in the world? How many people in the world know that the first hijrah was from Mecca to Aksum, and only the second hijrah was from Mecca to Medina? You see,
Right.
In about 615, the governor of Mecca was really fighting the small amount of people whom the Prophet Muhammad had as disciples. And they came to him and they said, what should we do? And there's this wonderful phrase in the Hadith, which says, go to the country of the Lion of Judah, where justice reigns.
Yeah.
Tell him that your God and his God is the one God that who is the Lord of the earth, and he will tell you. And so the first Islamic refugees came to Ethiopia in about 650 and came to see the king in the in the Aksum. They were brought before him. And there's a lovely Ethiopian legend about that, of this particular meeting. He starts by asking them, what does your new religion say about my Lord and Master Jesus Christ? And the speaker of the Muslims who had come to Ethiopia said, in our new religion, we call him Isa, and we believe that he is one of the greatest prophets. Then he said, what does your new religion say about my mother, the Holy Virgin Mary? And then they did something extraordinary. They said, we see her as the Virgin Mother of the great prophet. And they started to tell him to actually to read out of the Quran, the Maryam Surah. And it says, the emperor started to cry when he heard how Maryam, or the Virgin Mary, was also revered in the Islamic religion. And that's the third question was, what does your new religion say about my protector, the holy angel Gabriel? And they said, we call him Jibril, and he is the one who brought the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad. And at that moment, the emperor drew a line on the sand, and he said, it's only this thin line that separates us from each other. You can stay in my country. So we must realize Ethiopia is the only country in the world where Islam did not come with fire and sword, and where Islamic and Christian people have been living together in peaceful coexistence for over 1,500 years.
Yes, that is extraordinary. I apologize for being for saying the wrong thing, because I recognize that Islam has been in Ethiopia for centuries, and I remember that story. I growing up around a lot of Muslim Americans, that Ethiopia has a certain level of pride. There's a certain level of pride, especially amongst Ethiopian Americans, Somali Americans, people African Americans in general, who are Muslim. they always remember, Ethiopia as that that kind of bastion of faith, and a certain type of, I guess, what would you call it? The first, I want to call it the first, nation to take in, sort of refugees or people that are looking for safety. So yeah, I appreciate you for explaining that. I want to let David chime in here if he has anything that he wants to ask before we go on to.
Well, I just had a random historical question. What do you think is the origins of the lioness of Gobedra near Aksum?
Undoubtedly, this must be from the pre-Christian days, when the Aksum kingdom, when the leaders of Aksum still had the many gods, and certainly the goddess is definitely older than 330 AD.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I must say to you, nobody knows who did it, what time it is, and a lot of research has to be made about her. But she's a beautiful lioness, isn't she?
Yeah, it's a stone carving of this lioness on phonolite rock. Is that right?
Right, absolutely right. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I have an interest in anthropology, so I like to look at some of the original religions that shape the foundations of the cultures that have then turned into these great empires over time,
You see, there you are absolutely right. You only need to go about 30, 40 kilometers from Aksum, and you have one of the oldest temples devoted to the god Al-Maka. By the way, the same god as you find on the other side of the Red Sea in Yemen. You see, the Sabbath trend, which came in about 1000 before Christ, is absolutely evident. And now the German Archaeological Society, they have been digging in Yeha, the place is called Yeha, and they have found incredible new things. And they're telling me they've gone as far as 900. And I know one of the excavators there, and when they went, I told him, don't you ever dare come back before you reach the year 1000 before Christ, because then the whole legend of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon will start becoming history and not a legend. Wow. And we are already there, as I said, 850 BC, but there's a tick more, and I'm quite convinced that we're definitely going to reach that age.
So what would you say to folks who say that is a legend, the claim of the Solomonic line, as a historian yourself?
For me, as a historian, it's meaningless. To be honest with you, who cares? The only thing is the fact. I would call it an ideal identity. The forming of a nation has always been based upon a legend. What would Great Britain be without the legend of King Arthur? What would Germany be without the legend of the Nibelungen? And what would Ethiopia be without the fact that every Ethiopian knows that King Solomon and Queen Sheba had a son, and who was the first emperor of Ethiopia? My dear friend, if this has led to the fact that a whole nation has survived and had this identity for 3,000 years, who in heaven's name cares whether it's a legend or whether it's a historical fact?
Mm-hmm.
It's the ideal affiliation that makes up a nation, nothing more.
Yeah, there's even legends around the American founding fathers,
Yes. Yes.
Your Highness, I want to get to something a little more closer in time, and that is to talk about how Ethiopia remained independent during the period of European colonialism, and what significance that has when trying to understand world history. So, during the 19th century, Africa was basically, I've always understood it as kind of being swallowed up by European powers, and they say, kind of carved up amongst European powers, and I want to talk about the European colonialism and how Ethiopia remained independent during the period of European colonialism, and what significance that has when trying to understand world history. So,
well,
yes.
You see, the most interesting fact is that Ethiopia had its first connections with Europe, and it could easily have turned into colonialism, and it is a miracle it didn't. Already in, when we talk of the age of colonialism, we're talking about the 19th century. I'm talking about the first real connections with the European world after the Middle Ages in about the 15th and 16th century with the Portuguese. And it should not be forgotten that the Ethiopian emperors of Gondar had very close, and Shoa had very close relations with the kingdom of Portugal. And lo and behold, in 1541, we had this great war against a Muslim leader in Ethiopia, and they were really winning the situation when the brother of the very famous world discoverer Vasco da Gama, by the name of Christophorus da Gama, landed on the shores of Massawa in the 1541, and they heard that up in the highlands the Christian brothers were being invaded by the Muslim. And can you imagine 800 Portuguese riflemen with a few little cannons went to join them, and a major army of, let's say, 50 to 60,000 men on the side of Ahmed Grang, Ahmed the left-handed as he was called, against about 30,000 Ethiopian troops and 800 armed, modernly armed people from Europe, won the day. And they saved us from this invasion of Muslim fanatics. So what happened there? Easily, this would have been a wonderful case for Europeans to stay and conquer a country. It is very interesting. The only thing the Portuguese were interested at that time was not to colonize Ethiopia, but it was a religious matter. They wanted Ethiopia to become Catholic. And it's fascinating. At that time, the king said, well, why not? We've always, there was not really been a great difference between us and Rome. And it was Chalcedon in 452 was a misunderstanding anyhow. So we are all Christians. Why not? And it's very interesting, the Emperor Cisneros had become a Catholic. He had accepted the Catholic faith, and a Catholic patriarch for Ethiopia was already named. And then they made the greatest mistake, which they, by the way, did not do when they were in China. At the same time in China, but these were the Jesuits in Ethiopia. And I think in China, it was people from the Benedictine from the Benedictine corps that went out. In China, they accepted half of the Chinese traditions and incorporated it into the Catholic Mass. In Ethiopia, they said, from now on, you have got to use Roman liturgy in a country which had a liturgical history far older than that of Rome. And at this moment, both the clergy and also the aristocrats rebelled. And the emperor had to step down. Emperor Cisneros had to step down, and his son, Emperor Fasilides, came to power, and he threw the Catholics out. and professed the Ethiopian Orthodox faith, which has become since then the religion of all Ethiopian emperors. So it is fascinating that at that time the Portuguese did not have any colonial ambitions. Now, in the 19th century, by that time, Ethiopia had become quite a strong nation, and with due respect, I should be calling him great, Emperor Manelek. And let me tell you something, it is a falsehood to believe that the Ethiopians and the Italians who fought each other at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, that there was a great difference as far as armaments is concerned. This is legend, to believe Ethiopians were fighting the Italians with swords and they had cannons and rifles. I have to tell you, thanks to the French, and thanks to the great perception of what was coming of Emperor Manelek, we were armed with the most modern French armaments that you can think of. So from that, we were on pair. And that is one of the reasons why we won the war in the Battle of Adwa, which became the first sign for the liberation of Africa. This is, you could say, whilst other countries were still trying to colonize Africa and still believed they were in the highlight of the colonial period, here was a black nation defeating one of the major European countries. And that shocked the world. And for Afro-Americans, I can tell you, their identity with Ethiopia started there. In Harlem, there's one of the oldest churches for Afro-Americans. It is called the First Abyssinian Church. And, everybody believes they would be Ethiopian Orthodox. No, they're Baptist. But they started calling themselves Ethiopian, The same thing, interestingly, happened in South Africa. All over the world, where Black people lived, Ethiopia became a key word for liberation.
That's a very good synopsis, Your Highness. When you think about the history of Ethiopia in terms of its connection to the wider African diaspora, you always think about the struggle and the fight for freedom, and Ethiopia always is kind of placed at a higher status amongst people of the African diaspora for its fight for independence. So with that, I want to let David chime in if he has something else that he wants to come in with.
So, that's one of the things that I think is lost in the current conversation in America, in which, so much of the conversation that is supposed to be representing African-American pride and pride in African culture is dominated by academics who are artificially inserting their ideology of socialism or communism as the only game in town for African pride. But history does not speak that kind of record so clearly, does it?
With due respect, I was once asked, who is an Ethiopian? And my answer was absolutely straightforward. Every person who calls himself, he's a free man, has the right to call himself Ethiopian. And I'm thinking about African brothers and sisters, Afro-American brothers and sisters in particular. And I would like to emphasize what it means to us. Yes, we know what you've gone through. Yes, we know how they have made you feel that you are an inferior race. We all know that and we feel with you. And be proud, because our history is your history. You don't need anything else. Say, I am an Ethiopian. I am Black. I am an Ethiopian. And go and if you want to compare yourself and your history with Ethiopian history. Every Afro-American has the right to call himself an Ethiopian.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. I like that. That's nice. Your Highness, I want to get into this because I think this is important for people to know, especially younger people who, we know about, the history. Well, there's a lot of pride around Ethiopia and the history of Ethiopia, but I think, and there's a lot of pride around, His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie. But what I think people don't realize is that, in his in his early stages, before he became emperor, Ethiopia was going through a period of provincial conflict, particularly in 1916 with the Battle of Sagale. Can you explain what was happening in Ethiopia prior to Emperor Haile Selassie's reign?
Well, you see, the great problem of Ethiopia started with the death of our great Emperor Manelek. And he had no children, but he had made his grandson, Emperor Ieyasu, as his successor. Now, when he came to power, Ieyasu was a teenager and was really not had a lot of, let's say, put it this way, a lot of humanly understandable weaknesses. But what we found out later, and every Ethiopian would tell you the reason why Ieyasu was deposed was simply because he had too many wives, he had too many affairs, and he was very close to the Muslims. And I have to tell you, as far as that part of the history of Ieyasu is concerned, we now know that he had a great perspective for Ethiopia. And he was one of the first rulers to say, what am I talking about? Half of my people are Muslim. So I cannot only call myself the king of the Christians. I am the emperor for every Ethiopian, whatever religion he believes. And it is simply untrue that he ever took up, he gave up his Orthodox faith and became a Muslim. Whatever that narrative was, and that was the reason why he was deposed, because Ethiopia was not ripe for this way of thinking, and certainly the ministers of Emperor Manelek who had survived and were thinking of Ethiopia in a completely different way, they really could not understand him, and this was too much for them, and that is the reason why he was deposed. Now, the Emperor Ieyasu was deposed, and his daughter was made Empress Zewditu, and the then young Ras Teferi became crown prince because she didn't have any children, and he became king regent of Ethiopia. And I must tell you, if you ask me, the finest days of the late emperor's rule were the days when he was regent. Up to 1935, he had already become emperor by the year 1930. And all these years, the age between 16 and 1935, when the Italians came, these were the finest times where the emperor literally catapulted Ethiopia from the Middle Ages into the 20th century. Right. Following the footsteps of our great Emperor Manelek, he started to educate people. Schools were being opened everywhere. The first hospitals were opened during Manelek's period. They were expanded. More hospitals were opened. Many Ethiopians were sent abroad for training. And Ethiopia became a member of the League of Nations. He was the first emperor. Well, he wasn't emperor, he was regent at that time, but he was the first representative of Ethiopia of that caliber who came to Europe. And his first visit, which was in 1924, was, unbelievable for people to believe, when all the rest of Africa was being colonized. How could they see a man from Nigeria, a man from God knows where, because they were all under colonial rule and there could not be a state visit. And so you could say the first African state visit that took place was in 1924, when the Prince Regent, the Rastafari, came to Europe. He saw practically all the major European countries, and everybody started to talk about Ethiopia. And I have to tell you, his greatest achievement was also although there were other people who opposed it, that Ethiopia became a member of the League of Nations.
Right. And I think a lot of people don't know. I don't know how many people know this, but Ethiopia had also, I think at that time, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Ethiopia was undergoing a struggle to abolish slavery at that time, and this was a problem. I mean, everywhere. I don't want to just single out. We shouldn't just single out Ethiopia. We should say slavery at that time was rampant everywhere. But Manelek, Emperor Manelek, and Emperor Haile Selassie strove to abolish slavery in Ethiopia.
In a very, that they were the first legal, punishment for being a slave owner. Already happened as you rightly said, in the reign of Emperor Manelek, and they were made more harsh in the era of Empress Zewditu by the Prince Regent Haile Selassie, who played about that time Rastafari, who played a major role. There's no doubt about it, and it is one of his greatest achievements also of that slavery should be completely abolished in Ethiopia by that time.
Right. Well, now getting into, you mentioned Empress Zewditu a couple of times, and I do want to mention her, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't. So, very, very few, I think very few people know about the reign of Ethiopia's only empress, besides Makeda, but those who mention her are those who understand the history of Ethiopia. They have argued that she had a much more conservative a view of things, and that her efforts to bring Ethiopia into the 20th century was sort of laxed. Do you believe that, or is that an accurate assessment of her?
It might be true that she was not as liberal-minded as the young Rastafari at that time. Right. But her greatness lies within her understanding of her own personality, that the challenges of the 20th century were not going to be solved by her way of thinking, and by allowing her regent to take over complete and utter power, which she invested him with. And there might have been a few lords who always questioned that, and there were one or two incidents in the time when the power of the young Rastafari was questioned, but they were more or less amicably solved. Even we must understand when Rastafari even was not enough for him, that the title was not enough for him, and he begged her to become king. She allowed him. This is something which very few people don't seem to realize. He was made king, not emperor. 1 year before her death, from 1929 to 1930, he was King Teferi.
Okay.
You see? So that shows you what a wide, what a wonderful, loving, mother-like figure she was to the young emperor, and that she didn't want absolute power. This was not her, and she knew what it meant to be a woman in Ethiopia in those days, and that she had to rely on people like Rastafari in order to get an understanding of the new 20th century situation in this world. So her greatness lies in her understanding of her limitations.
Right. David,
Your Highness, could you distinguish between the title of king and emperor in this context?
Yeah. The title of the king is in Amharic, it is called Negus, and that is what Emperor Haile Selassie received as a title after becoming Ras. He was Ras Teferi from 1916 up to 1929. And for 1 year, he was given the title of King of Gondar, because with the title of king, you also need a territory. You have to be king of. So he was made King of Gondar. And then you become Nugusenegest, which means King of Kings. That is why the name King of Kings comes off, is that underneath you, in former days, you had many kingdoms who were more or less autonomous, but under the auspices of the Ethiopian emperor. That is why they're called, like in Persia, you called him Shah in Shah, the Shah above all Shahs.
Right.
That is, these are the two titles which are equivalent to one another.
Right. Okay, so I want to go further, and I want to mention something that you have stated, which is that the beginning of the Second World War did not begin with Germany's invasion of Poland under Hitler, but rather with Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 under Mussolini. Can you explain why that is, and if that is in fact true, and why you think that is?
You see, Mussolini, when he came to power, he wanted to reinvent the Roman Empire. He found a few terrible, let's call them black spots. And one of them was undoubtedly the fact that Italy had lost the Battle of Adwa. So he said, we must do something about it. And you realize the whole Ethiopian campaign of 1935 was under the banner of revenge for Adwa. This was this is the war cry of the Italian soldiers when they came and marched into Ethiopia in 1935. Now we come, people forget this completely. The reason why we lost the Battle of Maicho in 1936 was due to the fact that we were far too inferior as far as armaments are concerned. And the main armament, which apart from 500,000 Italian soldiers who had been imported from Italy into Ethiopia, he had about 1,000 airplanes. Ethiopia only had 8 airplanes, mostly for transportation, and not a real air force in the meaning of the sense of the word in Europe. So there was a vast difference in armaments. And not only that, you must realize that during the Second World War, not even Adolf Hitler used gas at the front. I suppose because he himself was gassed during the First World War, and he knew how terrible it can be. And it is the most terrible death. You die. Your feet start burning and your entire body is burnt, literally. And this is the only time that gas was used during the Second World War. It was used by the Italians in Ethiopia. And that is, there was no reason, apart from the fact that they had hundreds and hundreds of aeroplanes throwing normal bombs. That was not enough. But the incendiary bombs with mustard gas was the end of it all. And no country in this world could have survived a war like that. And that is why we lost the Battle of Maija.
Now, you know, I know a lot of people, well, I can say people, younger people that we've had conversation with have sort of, they dispute whether Ethiopia was in fact colonized with the Second Italian invasion, or whether it was occupied. So
yes.
Yeah.
I would also say that it was never really colonized, because first of all, you need to conquer the whole of the country in order to call yourself a colonial hero, which the Italians never did. They had occupied the major centers, the cities, but the hinterland was in the hand of Ethiopian patriots for over 5 years. So I myself always use the word and the term Italian occupation of Ethiopia between 1935 and 1941. 36 and 41, these 5 years.
Okay, we've cleared that up, guys. Now, so hear that. David, is there anything that you want to add?
No, I want to just keep going with where you're going with this.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so now, you know, people don't really, you know, I mean, when you talk about the Second World War, a lot of people don't realize that, you know, there was a speech given by Emperor Haile Selassie at the League of Nations, and you know, it almost seemed sort of like, you know, a prophetic message, you know, that he was giving to the League of Nations, because at that time, you know, I mean, if we subscribe to, you know, the fact that Ethiopia was in fact the first place to where the Second World War began, you know, we can say that, you know, Emperor Haile Selassie's message of, you know, it is us today, it'll be you tomorrow, you know, it's in fact a very prophetic message. I mean, because I think they didn't really take that seriously. They thought, oh, you know, this guy, he's just talking, you know, whatever. And then a couple of years later, you know, we see in fact exactly what happened.
You know, we have to understand that Ethiopia only joined the League of Nations hoping and knowing that the Europeans had their eyes set on Ethiopia as the only non-available African country, or still available African country. So we said we need partners, we need friends. And we joined the League of Nations because we believed that after the First World War, the Charter of the League of Nations would be respected by every member, and there was a unified agreement that sovereign nations, it was wrong and illegal to attack sovereign nations. Now, the major countries who dominated the League of Nations, Great Britain and France, had a different problem at that time. They wanted to keep Italy out of the axis, or between Germany and Italy. So, in order not to, let me use the right word, in order to appease Mussolini, they shut their eyes when all this injustice was being done over Ethiopia. And you are so right, the speech of the emperor was very prophetic. This little match that has been lit in my country will become an inferno and engulf all over Europe, are the words he said. And you know, there is a magnificent scene. He comes in, and all the fascist journalists who were assembled there started to whistle. They started to sing songs. And you know, the president of the League of Nations, who had fascist leanings, did not do anything until the representative of a small country, Romania, the foreign minister called Titulescu, stood up and he said, Monsieur le Président, à la porte les sauvages. Mr. President, away with these savages. It's only then that the president reacted and called in the security and asked that, they told them to chase the Italian journalists out. It shows you that even that day, and by the way, Emperor Haile Selassie was the first and only head of state to ever address the League of Nations. Never before him and not after him. And it is true that some people say the end of Ethiopian sovereignty also became the end of the League of Nations. You see?
Yes.
And so you have this man who had no country, who went to exile in England and was living there, recognized by nobody. Don't forget, Great Britain was one of the very first countries to recognize the King of Italy as Emperor of Ethiopia. See?
Yes. That's it's a remarkable how, how much I think a lot of people, especially like, going through, the pandemic and stuff like that, we're suffering and stuff like that. But I always think to myself, and I was telling David this, I said, we don't really appreciate, how much a lot of people, during the Second World War suffered in exile, suffered, wars, and that was years, and I always think to myself, I shouldn't be so complacent, because they had to suffer a lot more than I have, even though I don't necessarily agree with so much of the lockdowns and everything like that. I still recognize that, we should be a little bit more appreciative of the fact that, there were people that fought for our freedom, that suffered and died, that lived in exile, and, so that we could have the freedom that we have, today.
Absolutely. So, and he had a hard time. I have to tell you, the 5 years in exile in Bath, he himself writes in his memoirs, these were the most terrible years of his life, where he had to suffer neglect, where the British government didn't really help him at all, not financially, not politically. And it is very interesting. Only after the fascist Italy became part of the axis between Berlin and Rome in 1940, did they agree to help us regain our independence. So for 5 years, the emperor was there just waiting and praying in Bath, perhaps sometimes even giving up the hope that he would ever return to his country. And when this came, the British attitude changed completely, and they decided to help us. At what then became the first major Allied victory, when the emperor marched in Addis Ababa on the 5th of May, 1941, Ethiopia became the first, let us call it, Allied nation against Hitler that was also relieved, and that where the emperor had regained his throne. So Ethiopia became the first country to be liberated from the fascists and the Nazis.
Great. Yeah. David, did you?
Now, what are some of the lessons about power and statecraft that we can learn from the history of Ethiopia and how you've chronicled it, Your Highness?
Mr. Gornoski, I would say, don't appease dictators. You know where it led us in the 30s, and I know where it will lead us tomorrow. So my great intercession with the Western countries is, for heaven's sake, stop giving aid to African dictators. Don't appease them. I know Henry Kissinger taught you, using a German word, realpolitik is the key word that one hears when Europeans talk about Africa. And what does actually realpolitik mean? It only means you might be the greatest dictator on God's earth. As long as you are in power, we Europeans and Westerners will come and bow down to you and worship you. God help you if you're no longer in power. That, unfortunately, is the basis of the African policy of many Western countries, and I feel that is wrong. They cannot complain about more migrants coming from Africa while they themselves are condoning the major exporters of migrants in the world. Who are they? It is the African dictators who do not allow their own people to lead a normal, civilized life in their own countries, that are leading thousands and 10,000s of our African countrymen to lose their country and come to Europe.
Yeah.
And that's what happened in a country like Libya too, right? With the
Absolutely. Absolutely. They were appeasing. They love appeasing dictators. They loved appeasing it in the 30s. Haven't they learned lessons? Can't you see that day when Neville Chamberlain came back from Munich with a piece of paper saying, peace in our times? What did he give him? Half of Czechoslovakia, appeasing the dictators. You see, it's only then, after it was already, far too late, when Poland was invaded, that the Europeans started to wake up. Well, the Western powers started to wake up. Until then, it was appeasement policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to ask about your book, your best-selling book about manners. Could you speak on that a little bit? I'm curious a little bit about that.
Well, it's very funny, Mr. Gornoski, that it needed an Ethiopian to come all the way from Ethiopia to write a book on manners in Germany. But I'm very grateful that the German people accepted it in a gentlemanlike way and say, who the hell is he to tell us what our manners should be? But I think it was a good thing if you have somebody like me, who's undoubtedly been influenced all his life by two major countries, Great Britain and specifically Germany. And my idea was they should see how a man who knows a little bit about their culture, a man who knows a little bit about their history, and who knows a little bit also about the history of their civilization, to say, what is it, what you Europeans have been calling the so-called European values, and to deal with them. And my book is certainly, the word is misleading, is not about how to eat on table, how to behave on table. There are a few things about it as well. But the main thing is it is about the inner voice in you. It is, how do I live by respecting a human being? That is the greatest person who has manners, is the one who respects the man he has in front of him. You know, I keep saying the way to find out if somebody has manners or not is to go out in a restaurant with a human being, not to see whether he can cut his meat well or whether he knows how to order the right wine. No. How to see him handling the waiter. Then you know what manners all are about. How a man who is with you treats the waiter, whether he sees him as a respected person. That is what his manners all about. But normally, you know, he wants to mistreat him, he wants to show off, and he wants to say, this wine is useless, bring me another bottle. And what he doesn't know is that he gets the same bottle only, you know, takes it out and brings it back again, things like that. But it's all, manners are all about how to live in peaceful coexistence with your neighbor and how to respect each other.
So, Your Highness, how are the manners of Europe in the 21st century thus far? Are we in a good direction?
I tell you one thing, what I really am very glad to say. If you asked me that about my generation, I would have given up. We were terrible. But I'm extremely hopeful about the new generation. And I can assure you that the young people in Europe, and I know this is devastating to many people who don't want to understand, these new generation of Europeans have much more manners than my generation. Don't forget, my generation was the 68ers. And you know what 68 meant to Europe? It was exactly not to have manners, you know.
Yeah. That's you know. Well, here we go. You know that we're doing something right. At least you know.
Somewhere. Yeah.
He didn't say America was doing it.
Yeah.
I know America.
About young Europeans.
I know too little of America.
Right. Well, they're doing something right. Maybe we need to learn from them. You know, we need to imitate them. But Your Highness, I want to get down to some of our final questions, because you know, this is I think very important for people to understand. You know, which is you know, after decolonization in Africa, you know, you see the introduction of, say, like, you know, new political ideologies, like, you know, communism, you know, and, you know, various political ideologies. And Ethiopia itself, you know, by the 1970s, you know, the late 1970s or middle 1970s, was going through a period of, you know, a political shift. And you know, and not to put it lightly, you know, we see the results. What I'd like to know is how the introduction of communism and Marxism actually entered into Ethiopia. You know, I mean, you know, we know about the Derg and, you know, and Mengistu Haile Mariam, but I would like to get more of an explanation of how Marxism kind of crept into Ethiopia. It just seems so, with a nation that has a, you know, like you said, this ancient history, this long, you know, history. It's just like, how could something like that creep in and distort everything and corrupt everything? It's amazing to me. It's baffling.
Well, this is the $1 million question, undoubtedly. And I have to tell you, we have to be fair.
Okay.
Why did the Ethiopian Empire end? I suppose it is because we were not able to read the signs that were already there in Ethiopia since 1960. You know, this was the first revolution which we had when the imperial bodyguard rebelled against the emperor. But at that time, the army was still behind the crown. And so the emperor was given another chance. And I'm afraid to say, these 14 years that was given to us by God, we did not make use of it. Unfortunately, change, which was desperately needed in Ethiopia, did not come from the top. Ethiopia was in desperate need of a new constitution. We didn't have a new constitution until it was forced upon us in 1974. I feel that the late emperor made a major mistake not to have gone into exile, or not exile, to pension himself in favor of his son when he reached the age of 80. Imagine if he would have done the same thing what Emperor Manelek did once he knew his days were counted. If he had given his son into the responsibility of the Ethiopian people, here is my son. See him as your brother, see him as your father, see him as your son. And give him the loyalty which you showed to me. And here is the beginning of a new age, and he will lead you into full democracy in Ethiopia. I can assure you, had this happened, Ethiopia would still be a constitutional monarchy to this very day. Unfortunately, things did not go that way. We did not want to show any kind of change in these 14 years, so we were forced to accept change. Why do you believe that in the latter part of the 20th century, out of all places, Great Britain has still the crown? Do you know the king of Egypt, the last king of Egypt, King Farouk, made a great prophecy when Gamal Abdel Nasser and the other revolutionaries escorted him. They did it a much nicer way than what had happened to the Ethiopian emperor, by the way. They escorted him to his yacht to bid him, and give him military honors and put him on his ship so he could go to Italy. In any case, he turned around and he said, by the year 2000, there are only going to be 5 kings anyway. And they said, who could that be? And he said, the 4 kings and queens which you find in a deck of cards, and the Queen of England. You see, and that was quite a prophetic word. And coming back to England, the reason why there has never been a revolution in England is because they had a glorious revolution in 1666. They learned the lesson, something which many people don't know. The first country to cut the head of an anointed king was not France, as many people believe. It was England in 1641. They cut the first country to cut the head of an anointed king was Great Britain. And then they learned their lesson. And then they had this wonderful revolution, the glorious revolution of 1688, when they had given so many powers to the people. Everything that we depend upon today was written in 1688, the Bill of Rights. You see? And from then on, the crown became much more progressive than the people. Before the people asked for change, the crown had already instituted change. So they were kept going. And when the French Revolution came, the English were laughing their heads off because they said the rights you're wanting to get over there in continental Europe, we've had them for 100 years. You see? And this is the glory when the crown becomes the symbol of unity and where government is then given to the people. And this was my hope. And this was my dream as a young man, that we would one day have a truly democratic constitutional monarchy in Ethiopia. Unfortunately, it didn't come to that. And that is why communism was enforced upon us. Although you are right, where did it come from? And I must say to you one thing which people must understand. The Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China had nothing whatsoever to do with the Ethiopian Revolution.
Okay.
Why should they? Do you know what the Emperor of Ethiopia was called in the Soviet Union? The anti-fascist on the throne. He was revered by the Soviet Union as an anti-fascist, or one of the first anti-fascists. He was in very close contact, a very close friend with Khrushchev and Brezhnev. Why should they depose him?
Yeah.
And by the way, the Emperor of Ethiopia visited the People's Republic of China before Nixon.
Mhm.
You see? So I can assure you that the Chinese had no ill feelings towards Ethiopia. I'll leave it at that because I don't want to use the second line and the second phrase. But that I would like to state that these two countries had nothing to do with the fall of the Ethiopian Empire.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. This is very good. I think we got a good explanation for the turn of events that occurred in Ethiopia in the 1970s. So yeah, David.
And Mr. Braswell, there is also one thing about my generation.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to tell you, it is understandable that a whole new generation thinks in a new way. They cannot accept monarchy. They cannot accept established institutions. But what I'm asking myself is, why were 99% of all Ethiopian students of my generation, why did they only want the dictatorship of the proletariat as the only answer to Ethiopia's problems?
Right.
By the way, all those Ethiopian students were not graduates of the Lomonosov University. No, they studied at the Free University of Berlin, the London School of Economics, and Berkeley. You see? So that has been quite interesting for me. Why was it? It can only be that at that time, their teachers, even in Ethiopia, who had come from America, were all dismayed about the Vietnam War. You see, they hated their own country. So they taught them it is socialism that is good for you, because they didn't have Chinese and Russian teachers. Their teachers came from England and America.
Right.
You see? So that generation of Americans must have said, if you only knew what a terrible country we come from with this terrible war called Vietnam. You see? So the only thing is socialism. That is why a whole generation of Ethiopians was indoctrinated by that. I wish there were a few left, who would say, no, we don't want this monarchy. It's too old-fashioned for us. We want a democratic republic as we find in the Western countries. Why didn't you have this?
Yeah. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that, Western culture had already been kind of distorted.
Yes.
By the time that the Ethiopian students had gotten here, and so it's kind of like the snake in the garden. I'm whispering in your ear that, hey, we don't like our system. You shouldn't like your system either. So I will sow the seeds of discord and you can take that back. I mean, it's amazing, and I think that's something that right there is something that everybody needs to hear. That it didn't come from Russia or China.
Never.
And Russia and China's experience with communism came from Western countries too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Leave it up to us to make a mess.
It's interesting how Karl Marx had always predicted with his scientific theory that the Western industrial countries would be the first to take on the revolutionary stage of development, but it ended up seemingly to fall more in the hands of agrarian cultures that would take on his religious, zeal. And that's interesting, isn't it? It contradicted the claims of his scientific hypothesis, so-called scientific hypothesis, that this was an inevitable stage that would take place in industrial cultures, but it seemed to really find more fervent, soil in countries like Russia, like Ethiopia, who were more agrarian.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that is?
But this is fascinating, and of course, don't forget that Karl Marx also said that one day communism is going to be in a position where we will be selling the rope upon which we will hang the Western countries. You see, that is also a demise. You see, Marx was a very intelligent fellow who knew what was coming, and he knew also that only industrialized countries, and his ideal for the revolution was Great Britain, not Germany, where he stems from, because Germany was not as industrialized at that time as was England, you see. And there's this famous thing which he said about the Germans. And he said, I sincerely hope that communism is going to take over the whole world, but I hope it will never come to Germany. And he said, why? And they said, simply because the Germans will never understand it. If you order a troop of Germans to go and take that railway station, they will first go and buy themselves platform tickets. In former days, you had to buy tickets in order to go to the platform to welcome someone, you see. He thought that the Germans were too disciplined and would never accept a revolution. And this is very interesting that despite that thinking, that half of Germany became, a communist country for over 60 years. Or 40
Shannon
years.
and I have an interest in the work of a late anthropologist named René Girard, who taught at Stanford University. He was a member of the French Academy. And he always had this concept of, he called it the scapegoat mechanism. And he suggested that governments and monarchs originated from a societal need to raise up someone who could be worshipped or adored, and only to find whenever there was a time of famine or plague or trouble, you would then sacrifice and scapegoat the monarch. So he believed that monarchs actually evolved from this ritual need to raise up heroes and then sacrifice them when times are bad. Do you see that as kind of accurate?
Well, I'm afraid to tell you, it is hard to bear, but it's true. And that is what we all became. My father and many others became sacrificial lambs. That is exactly that. I would agree with it completely. Only I wish that their blood would also have restored peace to Ethiopia and have given Ethiopian all what they wanted throughout their lives: unity and democracy. And 47 years after the so-called revolution, Ethiopia is in such a bad state as it never was before.
Your Highness, can you speak on the current civil war situation in the country? What caused this? This is the most pressing thing that we're seeing out of the country. Many people are talking about it.
The cause of all evil in present-day Ethiopia is one thing: the evil constitution of 1995. It is because of this constitution that Ethiopians became divided. For the first time in the history of Africa, we became the first country to bring out identification cards with the words race written on it. Ethiopia, for the last 30 years, is the only country in the world that calls itself an ethnic federation. There is no other country that it calls itself that. Before Ethiopia, there was only one country that called itself an ethnic federation, and this should be known to the whole wide world, and that was racist South Africa. 1948, the National Party loses the elections. The Boers come into power. Mr. Malan, the so-called father of apartheid, becomes prime minister. 2 days later, he gives a press conference. And the journalist asks him, what is this word called? What is the true meaning of this word apartheid? And I give you my word, his answer was, apartheid is nothing else, nothing more than an ethnic federation. And you know how ashamed I am that this country called Ethiopia, that did so much to the decolonization of the African continent, the country that brought a man like Nelson Mandela with an Ethiopian passport, trained him in Ethiopia to send him back to South Africa, the country that is responsible for founding of the Organization of African Unity, that this country is one of the racist countries in the world. Isn't this shameful? Look at these wonderful countries like Namibia, the youngest African country to be liberated. Do you know, there's an article which is absolutely heavenly, especially for us Ethiopians today. It says, no policeman, no judge, no minister is allowed to ask a Namibian citizen what his ethnic backgrounds are. This is heaven. And in Ethiopia, through this terrible racist constitution, everything has been ethnicized. Our borders are ethnicized. We have ethnic borders, and we know, the world has shown us, when you have ethnic borders, you will soon have ethnic cleansing, and that is what you're seeing in Ethiopia. You know, our politics was completely ethnicized. None of the political parties were democratic or social democratic or conservative, or, you know, they were all ethnic parties. And above all, we must understand that they stopped teaching Ethiopianism in the school, so that a whole generation of Ethiopians, and don't forget, Ethiopia has now got a population of 120 million, out of which 85% are younger than 25 years. That means 85% of all Ethiopians only know the TPLF as an institution. And who taught them you are Ethiopian? No, they were raised from the family up to school, up to university by telling them you are Oromo, you are Tigray, you are Amhara. And how, and that shows you at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in London. What do these poor Ethiopian boys, radicalized boys, do? They go and pull down the only Black monument you found in England until that time, that of Haile Selassie I, which was put there in 1936, when he was no longer even emperor of Ethiopia. He was a simple man in exile. And you know what the epitaph read? From the anti-fascist society of England to the greatest fascist, anti-fascist leader of the world. And that is the monument they demolished.
Sounds like they've had the same whisper campaign from the American and British intellectuals, right?
Right.
Absolutely. You see? So this is what the state we're in. And I sincerely hope that the present prime minister, if he gets elected in a few weeks' time, that he will destroy, rivet by rivet, this terrible constitution, and at last makes Ethiopia a truly democratic federation, because that is what we need.
Yes. Okay. Well, with that great synopsis, I mean, I really, it's like we're going in a cycle once again, and hopefully we can get out of this cycle. We won't stop doing this. But what would you, Your Highness, like to see in Ethiopia, in Africa, the rest of the world? What would you like to see us headed and going for? I want to leave on a positive note.
Absolutely. I want to go back to the day when the Organization of African Unity was founded. I was 15 years old and was a pupil at the German school in Addis Ababa. And we had a play, we used to play with one another. He went up to an Ethiopian comrade and he said, "Where do you come from?" He said, "Are you out of your mind? I am an Ethiopian, 100% Ethiopian." Bang! He said, "What did I do?" He said, "Wrong answer. What shall I say? I am an African." And Mr. Braswell, when you see our present state of affairs, how much I long to these days where the winds of African identity were blowing all over the continent. Where are we today? Tribalism is back again. And tribalism is the end of Africa and the beginning of a new colonialistic era. We must ask ourselves, how did the Europeans manage to get hold of Africa in such a short period? Because of tribalism. They went and found themselves an ethnic group and said, "Your neighbor, he doesn't look like you. He speaks a different language, so he must be your enemy. Here are some guns, and if you fight against him with us, we'll give you more." How can we not understand it? And African liberty, African sovereignty can only be guaranteed in the future if we can go back to our pan-African wishes, longings, and also realities which we had in the 60s and 70s, which I'm afraid we seem to have lost. And Pan-Africanism, if there's one country where you see it at the best, are the Caribbean countries who are holding the torch up for Pan-Africanism. I'm afraid in Africa, it isn't a bright light which is being fanned. Tribalism is on the run, secession of African small countries. This is what we find in many countries, and I'm afraid this is the death of Africa. So let us brace ourselves to our duties and look back to the founding fathers of the new Africa, of the liberated Africa, and in their sense, in the sense of Kwame Nkrumah, Leopold Sédar Senghor, Haile Selassie, Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere. Let us sincerely believe that if we united, there is nothing we cannot do in this world. We can make Africa great. And in order to do that, we really need to polish up our African identity.
Well, thank you very much. It was very, very informative.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to talk to you both. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.